One risk is that when you start hearing talk of genocide from the US president and from NATO, this could be a prelude for intervention, more direct intervention in the war. But thinking even longer terms, what Putin is doing right now, he is sowing seeds of hatred between Ukrainians and Russians, which will give terrible fruits of violence for years, for generations. So what started really as the war of just a single person, just Putin's war, could turn out to be a major turning point in the history of relations between Russians and Ukrainians, with implications, again, for generations to come.
You mentioned the president's language. He's obviously used the term genocide now. We did hear him also talk about regime change in the past, but then that comment appeared to be walked back by the administration. But do you think, in the light of what we've now learned, do you think that that is now a legitimate goal for Western governments, regime change in Russia?
I think the question is whether it's a wise goal. I mean, it's very dangerous to talk about regime change. The aim of the war should be to protect the freedom of Ukraine and not to change Moscow. This is up to the Russian people. I think that we need to think again long-term about winning the peace and not just about winning the war. And winning the peace means to have a free and prosperous and democratic Ukraine. That should be the focus.
Yes, no, I appreciate and understand that. In the context of chemical weapons, of course, there is a very depressing legacy from the Second World War and even from the First World War in terms of their usage. Again, I think my question really is about how countries should react to ever more dangerous weaponry being brought onto the theatre.
Obviously, everybody should be extremely concerned about it, especially when we all have in mind nuclear weapons. And we are maybe in the most dangerous moment in world history since the Cuban Missile Crisis, when a nuclear war is suddenly a possibility. Still not very likely, but a possibility, a real possibility that we need to consider. And that's terrible news for the whole human race.
Can I ask you, you've predicted that one of the long tail consequences of this war, that we will see an escalation of military spending by governments. What will be the consequence of that spending in terms of healthcare, the energy transition program, higher taxation? Because obviously something has to be foregone if that money is going to be spent in armaments.
This is one of the most serious implications for the entire world. I mean, the last few decades have been one of the most peaceful eras in human history. Not complete peace. I live in the Middle East. I know there are still wars. But when you look at the numbers, and especially the budgets, average military budget, military expenditure of governments around the world has been something like 6%. In Europe, less than 3%. That's really amazing. For most of history, it was more like 40, 50, 60% of the budget of every king and sultan went to the military and fortresses and warships. The fact that we have the kind of modern healthcare systems and welfare systems and so forth, it's because the money is going to teachers and doctors and nurses and not to tanks. But now with this war, I mean, Russia is not a very wealthy country. Its GDP is smaller than Italy. It managed to build its military machine only by spending a lot more on its military and a lot less on healthcare. Nobody knows exactly how much, it's a secret, but estimates are around like 20%, not 6%. Now, if Putin wins the war, then we will see more and more countries copying or forced to copy Putin. We already see the German defense budget doubling within days of the beginning of the war. So if defense budget around the world would be 20%, 30% instead of 6%, that would come at the expense of our healthcare, of our welfare, and it will also come at the expense of fighting other dangers like climate change. And this would be a terrible catastrophe for the whole of humanity. So it's not just in the interest of the Ukrainians and in the interest of the immediate neighbors of Russia that we need to prevent Putin. It's really about defending the peace and the kind of world we got used to. And we got so used to it that we take it for granted. But if we are not careful, we will slide back into the jungle of war and violence in which countries are forced to spend far more on tanks and missiles and far less on teachers and nurses and welfare systems.
What then do you think we might see in percentage terms committed to military spending by Western governments going forward?
It depends on the development and the results of the war. If Putin loses and is seen to lose, that will actually safeguard the previous order. You know, when there is a norm and somebody violates the norm and is punished for that, then this actually strengthens the norm. But if Putin wins or is allowed to win, then we will see defense budgets around, not just in Europe, but around the whole world skyrocketing. And you know, the sky is the limit. I mean, now it's 6%, and then it's 10%, and then the neighbors see that you're spending 10%, so they spend 15%, and it's a race to the bottom. Historically, as I said, kings and sultans and emperors spend 50, 60, 70% of their budgets on their military. And if we are not careful, we could be back in that situation.
If Putin loses, and we don't know what that would look like at this stage, but let's make that assumption, do the parallels of the war crimes trials at Nuremberg or the compensation and reparations forced on the loser after the Second World War, do these parallels make sense in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war? And could we see President Putin, the oligarchs and close advisors in some kind of war crimes courtroom?
That's totally up to the Russian people, not to anybody from outside. Hitler did not have nuclear weapons. Putin has nuclear weapons. So anybody who has these fantasies about marching to Moscow, forget about them as quickly as possible. This war should be strictly about protecting the freedom and democracy of Ukraine. That's it. Leave the situation in Moscow to the Russian people. And again, focus not just on protecting Ukraine now, but about winning the peace afterwards. Europe and the West can make a commitment, should make a commitment right now, not just to help the Ukrainians during the war, but make a commitment to rebuild Ukraine after the war, to pour resources into Ukraine, to make sure that it becomes a prosperous society. This is what this will give heart to the Ukrainians, that they know that there is a future they are fighting for. And also this will be the best protection for Europe. The best protection for Europe against a Russian threat is not tanks and missiles and so forth. It will be a free and independent and democratic and prosperous Ukraine.
Professor, one of the consequences of the sanctions that have been imposed by Washington and Europe has been a perceived acceleration towards a global commodity-focused Bretton Woods III, something that replaces the previous monetary system and structure that has been in place ultimately since Bretton Woods II, and largely has been focused on a dollar-based system with the structure of the treasury market as a guarantor, if you like. The seizing of Russian assets and reserves overseas has thrown up questions about the use of the dollar system as a weapon. Do you think that has fundamentally damaged the system we've operated under in the global economy since Bretton Woods II? And should we be thinking about Bretton Woods III, which is much more gold and commodity focused?
Well, it depends who we are. I mean, from some perspective, I think that what we've seen is actually the system working well. That you cannot divorce finance from the rest of human reality. it shouldn't work as a completely separate system. It never works as a completely separate system. There is always, the financial system is based ultimately on human values. It's based ultimately on human institutions. Anybody who fantasizes that you can have a purely monetary system, there is no such thing, because money in the end exists only in the imagination of human beings. It's not, a banana that you can eat. It has no value in itself. It's just a story that we tell ourselves, and we need institutions to enforce this story, to enforce, for instance, contracts. And these institutions are human institutions. People inhabit them. They need to eat. They need sewage systems. So I don't think that we should dream about a pure financial system which operates in complete independence for what's happening to human beings. And in this sense, I thought that the way the system functioned was used in recent weeks, it's actually a sign of its strength and not a sign that it's weak and that we need to replace it.
Although the view from Beijing may be a great deal more suspicion about the system that it now finds itself very much trapped within. Could you talk more broadly about how you think Beijing now maneuvers in the light of the risk-reward scenarios presented to it, and whether it should work more closely with Russia at this stage?
When you look at the amazing achievements of China over the last 40 years, and you compare it to Russia, you see that consistently the Chinese have made different choices than the Russians. Russia has been engaged in one foreign military adventure after the other, and it was until now maybe the most successful military power of the 21st century, compared to the kind of failed American interventions in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, that the Russian interventions for the Russians were far more successful. And yet the economic dividends for Russia were almost nil. Look at the Russian economy. Now look at China. China has not been engaged in any direct military confrontation, serious confrontation with a foreign power since 1979. It consistently chose the road of peace and economic development, which is at the basis of the Chinese economic miracle. And in this, China followed the lead of previous countries, like Japan, like Germany, that after their defeat in the Second World War, built economic prosperity on commitment to peace. So I hope that the Chinese, when they look at their own experience and the experience of others and compare themselves to the failed path taken by the Russians, they would, and I think they know that they benefited maybe more than anybody else from the global system of peaceful trade, which was established and maintained in recent decades. So I don't think they will be quick to turn their back on these successes and try to imitate the disastrous path that the Russians have been taking.
And just one final question as we wrap up here. Can there be such a thing as 50% sanctions rather than 100% sanctions? We're in a peculiar place where countries like Germany are still sending hundreds of millions of euros to Russia to pay for energy at the very moment where they're still trying to send support and military supplies to Ukraine. Does this make any sense at all?
Again, I'm afraid that I'm not expert on that. I'm not sure. I mean, in principle, yes. I mean, you don't always have to choose 0 or 100%. There are always places in between, and we saw it also with many previous sanction regimes. Whether it's working, whether the cost analysis, the cost-benefit analysis makes sense or not, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't really understand the intricacies of the German economy and the kind of weapons deliveries to Ukraine, so I can't say. But historically speaking, yes. I mean, there are always middle ground positions.
And Professor, as we go, you have said many times in many interviews that this was such a shock because it's the first time in a very long time that we've seen one country try to seize the territory of another and ultimately try to extinguish that country's existence. Do you think that we can go back across that line to the status quo now that this has happened?
Yeah, you know, since 1945, it didn't happen even once that an internationally recognized country was simply wiped off the map by the invasion of another country. And this is what really Russia is trying to do here. If it succeeds, it will be the end of the global order as we've known it. But it doesn't have to succeed. I mean, you know, the Ukrainians are fighting far more effectively and courageously than anybody, certainly Putin, imagined. And if Europe and the West give them the proper support, there is every reason to think that they can stop Putin from winning. And if this happens, then yes, we can still save the relatively peaceful order that we have known for most of our lives. If we don't do that, we will see the consequences all over the world with rising military budgets, with a very deep crisis in healthcare, in education, in the ecology, in almost every aspect of life. So I hope that the leaders make the right choices.